We tend to talk about willpower as a test of character. If you fail, you are weak. But self-control is actually a measurable, finite neurobiological function. It is a mechanical process running inside your skull. The medical proof that volition is anatomically localized dates back to a railroad construction site in 1848 with a foreman named Phineas Gage. An explosive charge detonated early, launching a 3-foot tamping iron upward. It pierced Gage's left cheek, tore directly through the front of his brain, and exited the top of his skull. Gage survived. His motor function and his intellect remained perfectly intact. But his friends noted that his personality was entirely eradicated. He became highly impulsive, impatient, and prone to gross profanity. His behavioral inhibition was gone. What that iron rod destroyed is now known as the prefrontal cortex. This dense cluster of neural tissue, right behind your forehead and eyes, is the evolutionary hardware responsible for impulse control. This 3D model shows how the prefrontal cortex divides its labor. The upper left region controls your I willpower. It forces the initiation of difficult, stressful, or boring tasks, like staying on the treadmill when you would rather stop. The right side handles your I won't power. This is the braking system that restrains your primitive urges, stopping you from reading a text message while driving or eating a second slice of cake. Down in the lower middle is your I want power. This acts as a compass, maintaining the salience of your long-term goals over immediate gratification. But there is an architectural flaw. This modern prefrontal cortex is forced to operate as a fragile overlay on top of the midbrain, the older, highly aggressive region that governs raw survival instincts and demands immediate reward. Because self-control relies on this specific physical brain structure, it is strictly governed by biological limits and energy constraints. When you give in to temptation, it is a mechanical failure of this system, not a flaw in your character. The prefrontal cortex is the most energy-demanding sector of the human brain. This makes your volition highly susceptible to metabolic bottlenecks. These fMRI scans illustrate what happens on less than 6 hours of sleep. The yellow zones, the prefrontal cortex, dim out completely. Simultaneously, the red midbrain zones pulse and expand, pushing the brain into hyperreactivity to primitive drives. This biological vulnerability was tested in a clinical study of patients recovering from severe substance addictions. Researchers implemented a targeted sleep intervention to see if resting the brain could prevent relapse. The researchers found a massive 0.70 correlation between gaining just 1 extra hour of sleep and sustaining sobriety. A rested brain was physically capable of remembering its goal to stay clean. Even when you are fully rested, the brain's real-time willpower capacity can be measured by your heart rate variability, or HRV. High variability indicates the brain is actively engaged in self-control. You can rapidly spike this metric. Slowing your breathing down to 4 to 6 breaths per minute instantly increases your HRV, physically shifting blood flow back into the prefrontal cortex right when you face a craving. The adult prefrontal cortex exhibits neuroplasticity. It responds to inhibitory demands exactly like skeletal muscle responds to weight training, physically increasing its mass and efficiency. Short, daily breath-focused meditation protocols force the brain to constantly notice distractions and return to a baseline. Over an 8-week period, this repetitive strain structurally alters the brain, physically increasing the gray matter density of the prefrontal cortex. Attempting to exert psychological discipline while these physiological baselines are compromised forces the prefrontal cortex to work against its own biology. Without sleep and regulated HRV, the machinery of volition is physically underfueled. There is a widespread professional assumption that maintaining discipline requires shame, guilt, and harsh self-criticism. We assume that feeling terrible about a mistake will prevent us from repeating it. To test this, researchers brought people actively trying to lose weight into a lab and intentionally forced them to break their diet. Each participant was required to eat a donut and drink a full glass of water, making them uncomfortably full. Then came the hidden phase of the study. The researchers asked the subjects to participate in a candy taste test, leaving pre-weighed bowls of sweets in the room to quietly measure how much they ate after their initial failure. Half the participants received no counseling. The other half received a simple 3-step self-forgiveness message, letting them off the hook. reminding them that everyone indulges sometimes and not to be too hard on themselves. This chart compares the consumption levels of the two groups. The self-forgiven group ate less than half the volume of candy compared to the control group. Shame triggers an immediate cortisol-driven stress response in the body. This chemical stress overrides the prefrontal cortex. It forces the brain to revert to the midbrain's primary directive, seeking immediate comfort and dopamine to soothe the anxiety, usually through the exact behavior you are trying to avoid. A similar sabotage happens when things go well, known as the goal-switching hypothesis. Merely tracking and celebrating a milestone satisfies your I will protocol. Once that box is checked, your brain instantly primes itself to indulge the competing I want impulse. Both severe self-criticism and premature celebration chemically disarm the prefrontal cortex, creating a state where behavioral relapse is far more difficult to resist. Our brains possess a cognitive blind spot called temporal discounting. When you think about your future self, your neural activity processes that future identity as a literal stranger. Psychologists measure this temporal continuity using a diagram. People are asked to select a pair of circles that represent how they view their present and future selves, ranging from completely disconnected to heavily overlapping. Individuals who choose the non-overlapping circles statistically carry higher financial debt and commit more ethical workplace violations for short-term gain. Researchers at Stanford University used 3D technology to artificially close this temporal gap. They brought college students into a virtual reality lab and had them interact with 3D avatars of themselves, aged to retirement. The students spent an hour interviewing and answering questions from the perspective of their own future lives. Afterwards, subjects were asked to allocate a hypothetical $1,000. The students who interacted with their older avatars allocated more than double the funds to a retirement account compared to the control group. You can bridge this gap with low-tech interventions. Writing a letter to your present self from the perspective of your future self, or actively visualizing mundane scenarios like grocery shopping years from now, forces the brain to internalize that reality. The brain struggles to prioritize the future beneficiary until it recognizes that distant person as a version of its current self. Unwavering optimism is often treated as a requirement for success, but behavioral economics data links rigid initial optimism directly to corporate SEC fraud when reality strikes and executives refuse to adapt. A study divided sedentary linen into two groups with the goal of exercising. One group received standard, highly optimistic motivation. The second group was forced to aggressively predict their own specific mechanisms of failure, documenting exactly how and when they would likely quit. The pessimistic, obstacle-predicting group doubled their exercise volume immediately and entirely sustained that output at the 16-week mark. Predicting exact failure parameters prevents cognitive shock. When things go wrong, it isn't an unexpected crisis that triggers the shame and relapse cycle. It is just a predicted variable you have already planned for. But planning cannot overwrite everything. For acute visceral cravings, you have to develop a clinical capacity called distress tolerance. Researchers placed abstinent smokers in a lab with an unopened pack of cigarettes. For over an hour, they were forced to slowly handle, unwrap, and smell the cigarettes in agonizing 2-minute increments without ever lighting them. In another study, individuals addicted to sugar were required to carry a marked, transparent container of Hershey Kisses with them everywhere for 48 hours without eating a single piece. Both studies relied on a cognitive protocol called surfing the urge. Subjects were instructed to focus entirely on the physical sensation of the craving. Instead of suppressing it, they acknowledged the intense discomfort as a temporary wave that would eventually peak and pass. Structured pessimism and distress tolerance, leaning directly into the physical discomfort rather than fighting it, are clinically validated tools to neutralize the midbrain survival instincts in real time.